When I was at the University of Texas at Austin, I was taught by Professor Neil Nehring, by Peter Berger, a German theorist, that modernism, which of course Wilde is prefiguring this transitional phase from Victorian England to post-Victorian, more fully industrialized modernist era of capitalism, that this modernism that comes out of this is basically elitist in orientation, that this must be rejected in lieu for some kind of political type of art. Not in terms of socialist realism, but something in the order of Brecht. And I think he was particularly interested in engaging the ideas of Walter Benjamin, which comes back to your own theorist Bloch, who was a colleague of Benjamin, who had a messianic notion of revolution, but also had a very materially grounded notion of cultural production, right? And was author as producer. He talks about at the end about the dangers of aestheticizing politics, which he thought the fascists were doing. And the importance was to politicize art, not in the socialist realist sense, reductive sense, but somehow to engage the artist as actually a part of the working class. This was sort of an embryonic idea that he was creating. It didn't really work out. But I think this controversy is still not really resolved, because in the discussions since then, since Wilde's in the 1880s and now 1930s and 40s and so on and so forth, today in the postmodern or whatever present we live in, the question of art and its role in consumer capitalism has now become very, very clear. Like, what can artists do in relation to the working class? In fact, the term working class itself has become deracinated because of all the ideological propaganda of the last 30, 40 years. Most people, as you know very, very well, workers that I come across, or one of my friends in Pittsburgh, a UE organizer, a very much honorable union, left-wing union in the 50s and 60s, often remind me that the working class in the United States think of themselves as middle class, right? So how could cultural producers or academic workers can engage these questions of utopia and imagination to the work of labor that's actually going on and losing? I don't think this question can be easily answered. In fact, I don't think any theorist or artists or writers can answer it without being arrogant about what they think they know. So my sort of provisional conclusion to this is that when we read Wilde, and we read the way in which he's attacking authoritarian socialism, he's very explicit about this. He's against the authority of the state, and so Wilde himself says he's sort of more of an anarchist, I think, later on. He does prefigure sort of the criticisms that the anarchist Bakunin and so on brought against state capitalism or state socialism, or however you want to describe the regime of the Soviet Union since 1917 and all the sort of satellite or closely related types of Marxisms and socialisms. But at the same time, we often wonder exactly this question of agency. How can we link up? And I think this problem of agency is not an easy one. One proposition I do have about utopia is that perhaps the utopian imagination emerges more often than not in moments of transition. We see that obviously in Wilde's case, between Victorian capitalism and the emergence of something new, the Russian Revolution, and the emergence of state capitalism and so on. And so his own thinking about these matters have to take a utopian turn, necessarily perhaps. As Marx and Engels were talking about, the early utopian socialists, they're part of their sympathy lay in the fact that these people represented the transition period between the feudal period, as it was ending, in the emergence of capitalism. And that's why their ideas had to be utopian, because they didn't have a working class to deal with. But now that we're facing deindustrialization and deracination and, of course, financial crisis and so on, the last 40 years, perhaps this is a time also when utopian imagination is necessary precisely to preserve some of the resources and energies, not so much to do the work of the self-activity that the working class must do for themselves. But I think Thompson, I like to end with a note of Thompson, because when you read E.P. Thompson's English, Making English the Working Class, you get a very distinct sense that part of the power of the English working class in the 1790s, as they were forming themselves into the early part of the 19th century, was not so much that they fomented a revolution, which they didn't, but they created a new distinct culture on their own. And part of this culture was reading of books. Tom Paine, Common Sense, Volney's history of the civilizations. And a lot of these texts and little pamphlets circulated around and became part of this artisanal working class culture. And I believe that these utopian novels of today, let's say Ursula Le Guin or Stevenson, perhaps could function the same way. When I talk to my students who are mostly from working class roots, or they work part-time jobs and workers themselves, you know, they have interest in things like Dungeons and Dragons and WoW, World of Warcraft, and all these other seemingly apolitical things. But actually, I don't know if they're apolitical entirely. Because I was talking to this particular student at the BGSU, Bowling Green State University, where I work part-time, and he was telling me that a lot of people feel closer to people with whom they play games online. And of course, we're quick to judge as Marxist or radical critics of the mass media that this is a simple case of alienation. But actually, these people that they do, hunts with on the online gaming, they feel so close that they actually move to their neighborhood. And they will put them up. They actually can go to these people and just sleep and go from place to place. Something I can't even ask most friends or even relatives to do. So there seems to be a kind of creation of new alternative communities. I'm not saying this is easily translated into politics, but there is some kind of energy always moving at the subterranean level. And I think we, as thinkers, as readers, and as students of the working class, we have to find a way to incorporate them, right? Just as we don't want to deny that there is some kind of creative act going on as a worker resists or refuses work, you know, just even by a little bit, right? That moment of resistance does exist, and we have to take that into account, even that if that does not lead necessarily to a strike, work stoppage, wildcat strike, to say nothing of a revolution. So I think this constant rethinking, reprocessing is something that Jason was talking about in relation to Derrida, and I thank you very much for your attention. And if you have any questions. Yeah.
Yeah, well, when you mentioned 1968 and that slogan, I thought the one you were going to come out with was "Be realistic, demand the impossible," which
it's a great slogan too. Yeah,
fits in with the topic of today's session, I guess. Well, I mean, just a kind of thought provoked by what you were saying. I mean, you both seem to be insisting on the necessity of utopian imaginings, but isn't the problem that doesn't the capitalist system, doesn't that present its own utopias and kind of, I don't know, capitalism is very good at, through the media, as presenting a sort of, I mean, utopia, which would not be a sort of socialist one, utopia where, I don't know, we're all kind of affluent consumers driving around in our magnificent new cars and having a choice of 800 varieties of whatever it might be. So I guess, is there something distinctive about, or maybe it's a stupid question actually, distinctive about a socialist kind of utopia? Because, as I say, the existing system seems quite adept at I don't know, capturing our dreams of a better future, but steering those into, I don't know, the idea of a totally consumerized, commodity-driven kind of future where we're all happy consumers. So I just, the problem is how to capture the utopian energies in a different direction, I guess. That's a rather incoherent question, actually.
No, I think this made me think about Jason's line in his paper about Bloch, how he was talking about the very fact that the idea of bourgeois rights as constituted by the French Revolution, for example, seems to us to be very limited, restrictive, because it only talks about the citizen, it excludes so many different people. And it's all true, but at the same time, he is very much emphasizes the fact that that particular notion of bourgeois rights has a sort of negation, in the sense that that particular notion is appropriated by different movements later on. And we can see that in the civil rights movement, where obviously people are speaking up for the right of, well, the right of voting, franchise. And that seems to be just calling for the right of bourgeois representation. But actually, through that kind of struggle, there is new spaces and new conversations that open up.